Today, we uncover a story that begins like any other summer in a quiet Midwestern town, but what seemed ordinary hid a deadly secret. Aaron Bennett, 23, carried a truth he could never share, and the people he loved most, the ones he trusted above all, became the instruments of his destruction. How does family turn from protection to danger? And what does fear disguised as honor cost a life? Aaron Bennett, 23, carried a secret that made him a target, even among the people he called family. Diagnosed with HIV just 2 years prior, Aaron had kept his status private, fearing judgment, fear, and rejection. In a town where rumors traveled faster than the morning bus, he had confided in only a few close friends, and even then, cautiously, never daring to cross the boundaries of his sister, Emily Bennett, and her husband, Jason Carter. For Aaron, life was a careful balancing act. Each day was spent navigating whispered stigma, casual cruelty, and the subtle, suffocating pressure of familial expectations. He had grown accustomed to the smiles that hid judgment, the polite nods that masked suspicion. Yet, even in this careful routine, danger often comes where you least expect it, when the people who are meant to protect you become the very ones plotting your downfall. Emily Bennett was known in Milford County as a devoted sister, community volunteer, and someone who held her family's reputation above nearly everything else. Her husband, Jason Carter, was outwardly charming, well-liked, and respected, a model husband on the surface. The kind of man who could easily be trusted. But behind closed doors, the couple's fixation on honor and appearances had begun to twist into something far darker. The tension had been simmering for months. Small disagreements, subtle criticisms, and whispered warnings escalated in private. Aaron's HIV status, once a confidential matter, became a point of anxiety for Emily and Jason. In their minds, it was no longer simply a health issue. It had morphed into a perceived stain on the family's reputation, something they believed needed to be erased. On a humid July morning, Aaron left his apartment in downtown Milford with no inkling that this day would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would shock the county. He stopped briefly at his favorite cafe, greeted the barista with a nod, and collected his usual coffee. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary start to an ordinary day. But ordinary days can turn sinister in the blink of an eye. By late afternoon, Aaron had not returned home. Friends began to worry. Texts went unanswered. Calls went ignored. Neighbors noticed Emily and Jason acting unusually tense, too rehearsed in their concern, too eager to reassure anyone who asked that everything was fine. Their story was consistent but vague. Aaron had gone for a long walk, perhaps to clear his head, and would be back soon. But deep down, an unsettling unease began to creep through the community, a suspicion that the cheerful facades of Milford County were hiding a darkness no one had anticipated. What happened next would reveal the unimaginable. The people who should have been Aaron's protectors were instead the architects of his downfall. The carefully maintained image of a perfect family, a picture of respectability, was about to fracture, exposing a truth so chilling it would leave Milford County questioning how appearances could mask such brutality. Emily Bennett had always been fiercely protective of her family's image, a trait praised by neighbors and friends alike. She volunteered at the local community center, hosted bake sales for charity, and attended every town event with a smile that seemed to conceal more than it revealed. To outsiders, Emily was the embodiment of grace and responsibility. But beneath the polished exterior, there was a simmering fear that her family's reputation could be tarnished by what she saw as unacceptable circumstances. Jason Carter, her husband, shared her concern, though his reasoning was less about fear and more about control. Charismatic and composed in public, Jason had cultivated an image of reliability and authority. Those who met him often found themselves trusting him immediately. Yet those closest to him noticed a subtle edge, a quiet insistence that things be done properly, that nothing reflect poorly on their household. Aaron, Emily's younger brother, became a source of unease in this carefully curated world. His HIV status, known only to a few, was now a secret that threatened to ripple beyond the family walls. In Milford County, the place where conformity often outweighed individuality, Emily and Jason saw a potential scandal not as a matter of health, but as a stain on the family's honor. Theirs was a mindset forged by whispers in the community, by neighbors who judged behind closed doors, and by the weight of tradition. subtly reshaped for a modern, small-town America. Tension had been escalating quietly, almost imperceptibly. For months, Aaron's attempts to live a normal life, dating carefully, attending social events selectively, maintaining his job at the local bookstore, were interpreted by Emily and Jason as recklessness, as threats to the fragile social equilibrium they maintained. Every conversation became a test. Every interaction, a silent battleground. It was not as if Emily and Jason were cruel by nature. They were ordinary people trapped in extraordinary fear. But the fear had metastasized into obsession. The thought of anyone outside the family discovering Aaron's condition became intolerable. Rumors, they believed, could ruin not just their standing in the county, but the very fabric of their household. What started as subtle manipulation, reminding Aaron of how careful he needed to be, suggesting that he think of the family, slowly evolved into something far darker. Late one evening, neighbors recalled seeing Emily and Jason speaking in hushed tones on their porch, their faces grim under the dim glow of a streetlight. No one could hear the words, but the intensity of their gestures suggested a plan, a calculated response to a perceived threat. Aaron, unaware of these discussions, continued his routines, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. In the days leading up to the incident, small signs hinted at the brewing tragedy. Aaron noticed subtle changes in the way his sister interacted with him offhand, remarks that seemed to carry double meanings, a sudden insistence that he remain at home rather than socialize, an underlying tension that made his own house feel less safe. He tried to brush off these instincts, attributing them to ordinary sibling disagreements. But deep down, an instinctive unease lingered, a sense that the people closest to him were no longer simply concerned, they were planning something. And so, as the humid July days stretched on in Milford County, the stage was set. Aaron, living cautiously, unsuspecting, became entangled in a web of fear, obsession, and misguided notions of honor that would soon spiral into irreversible tragedy. The morning of that fateful day dawned unusually still over Milford County. Sunlight filtered weakly through the overcast sky, casting muted shadows over the tree-lined streets. For Aaron Bennett, it was an ordinary day or so, he thought. He left his small apartment with the same careful routine he had maintained for months. Coffee from the corner cafe, a brief stop at the bookstore where he worked part-time, and a slow walk back home, the streets eerily quiet in the late morning lull. Emily and Jason, meanwhile, had been awake long before dawn. Their breakfast was perfunctory, silent. Each glance shared between them a wordless communication of purpose and resolve. Every movement was measured, every word calculated. They had spent weeks, perhaps months, letting fear and obsession ferment into a plan, a chilling solution to the problem they perceived in Aaron. By mid-morning, subtle signs of tension began to ripple through the neighborhood. A neighbor recalled seeing Emily pacing the driveway, speaking sharply into her phone, her voice low but strained. Jason lingered near the garage, hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes scanning the street as if rehearsing for a confrontation. No one could have guessed the darkness that had taken root behind the otherwise calm facade of their home. Aaron returned in the early afternoon, unaware of the trap laid before him. He greeted his sister with a cautious smile, remarking on the pleasant weather. Emily returned a smile that never reached her eyes, soft words hiding the intensity of her inner resolve. Conversation lingered briefly on mundane matters, a neighbor's new car, the town's upcoming festival, before Emily steered the discussion toward Aaron's future, subtly planting doubt, guilt, and fear. Jason entered the room shortly after, casually joining the discussion, his presence a silent assertion of control. The ordinary flow of a family afternoon was interrupted by a sudden, calculated insistence. Aaron should remain at home for the rest of the day, Emily said. Just a quiet day, she suggested, to keep things safe. Aaron, sensing the unusual tone, hesitated, but complied, never suspecting the sinister reasoning behind the request. Hours passed. Small, almost imperceptible cues, whispered instructions, brief glances exchanged between Emily and Jason marked the slow orchestration of what was to come. By evening, the tension in the house had become palpable, a heavy, unspoken weight pressing down on every surface. Aaron, sensing the subtle hostility, but not its full scope, began to feel trapped in the confines of a home that should have been safe. And then, as twilight descended, the unthinkable occurred. In a room where silence should have meant peace, Aaron found himself facing the ultimate betrayal. What began as hushed conversations and veiled warnings escalated into a moment of irrevocable violence, one that would shatter not only his life but the perception of safety in Milford County forever. The exact details of that moment, the methods, the movements, the final gestures, remain a haunting testament to how fear and obsession can transform ordinary people into perpetrators of unimaginable acts. When neighbors later asked Emily and Jason where Aaron had gone, their answers were careful, rehearsed, and chillingly calm. They painted a picture of a young man who had left voluntarily, perhaps upset, perhaps needing space, but still alive and well. Yet the atmosphere in the neighborhood, the subtle unease that had been mounting for weeks, told a different story, one that would only be confirmed when investigators began piecing together the evidence, a puzzle of deception, betrayal, and ultimate tragedy. By the time the night fully settled over Milford County, one thing was clear. The quiet town, so accustomed to appearances and polite facades, had witnessed the breaking of its most fundamental trust. And for Aaron Bennett, the cost of secrecy, stigma, and misguided notions of family honor had become fatal. By the next morning, a quiet unease had begun to ripple through Milford County. Aaron Bennett had not returned home. Friends who had texted him the previous evening received no replies. Calls went unanswered. Even the barista at the cafe mentioned casually to a neighbor that Aaron hadn't shown up for his usual morning order. What initially seemed like an ordinary absence gradually began to feel ominous. Neighbors, usually accustomed to the predictable rhythm of Aaron's life, started asking questions. It was a small town, after all. Missing routines did not go unnoticed. One concerned neighbor approached Emily Bennett, gently inquiring about her brother's whereabouts. Emily's response was practiced, her calm demeanor masking the storm behind the scenes. "Aaron went for a walk yesterday," she said softly. "He needed time to think. He'll be back soon." Jason Carter joined her on the porch, offering a nod of agreement that lent credence to the story. Outsiders would have seen nothing amiss. But those attuned to the subtle tensions, the brief, strained glances exchanged between the two, the slightly too tight clenching of hands began to sense that something was wrong. Hours turned into a full day. Concern among friends and neighbors intensified. A small group of Aaron's closest companions convened, discussing the uncharacteristic silence. Some had heard rumors, vague whispers about Emily and Jason's obsession with appearances, but they had never imagined such a situation. Still, worry began to transform into alarm, and a few decided to call the local police. The officers who arrived at the Bennett residence were polite but cautious. Milford County, like many small towns, had seen occasional missing person reports, but few escalated quickly. The initial response was procedural: check nearby areas, ask neighbors, gather preliminary information. Emily and Jason presented their rehearsed story flawlessly. Aaron had gone for a walk, they insisted. He was private, sometimes withdrawn. He would return. There was no immediate cause for alarm. Yet, even as the officers filed their report, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Witnesses mentioned seeing Aaron leave the apartment the previous day, but not return. Others recalled hearing raised voices late in the evening, voices that Emily and Jason denied ever existing. Though these details seemed minor, investigators would later see them as crucial threads, the first signs of a tangled web of deception. In the days that followed, the community's unease grew. Rumors, as they always do in small towns, began to circulate. Some whispered of family disputes. Others hinted at more sinister possibilities. Emily and Jason remained outwardly composed, attending church services, participating in community events, and continuing their charade of normalcy. But behind closed doors, investigators were starting to piece together a pattern, one that would eventually reveal the grim truth about Aaron's disappearance. Digital footprints provided additional clues. Text messages, location data from Aaron's phone, and CCTV footage from local streets offered investigators a mosaic of his final hours. Each piece, seemingly innocuous on its own, gradually painted a picture that contradicted Emily and Jason's account. Small-town appearances, they were learning, could be fatally deceiving. By the end of that first week, it became apparent that Aaron Bennett had not merely gone for a walk. The initial investigation, slow and tentative as it had been, began to pivot. Officers moved from routine questioning to a deeper probe. scrutinizing Emily and Jason more closely. Neighbors and friends were interviewed repeatedly. Community networks analyzed, and subtle contradictions in the couple's story began to emerge. The calm, everyday life of Milford County had fractured. Beneath the surface of polite smiles and well-maintained lawns, a tragedy of familial betrayal was slowly revealing itself, and the truth of what had happened to Aaron Bennett would shock the community to its core. As investigators delved deeper into Aaron Bennett's disappearance, the threads of Emily and Jason's carefully constructed story began to unravel. What had initially appeared as an ordinary missing person case now revealed subtle cracks that hinted at something far darker. Each small detail, an inconsistent statement, a missing timestamp, a neighbor's observation added weight to the growing suspicion that Aaron had not left voluntarily. Forensic evidence played a critical role. Aaron's apartment showed signs of disturbance, personal items slightly out of place, small traces of struggle that might have gone unnoticed to an untrained eye. Even minor details, such as the faint scuff marks near the living room doorway, suggested that the ordinary domestic rhythm of the Bennett home had been violently disrupted. Digital breadcrumbs provided further clarity. Aaron's phone record showed repeated attempts to contact friends and family, all unanswered or ignored. Location tracking indicated he had not moved beyond the immediate vicinity of his home after leaving for his morning routine. CCTV footage from the neighborhood captured Aaron entering the Bennett residence mid-afternoon, but no footage ever showed him leaving. For the investigators, these pieces began to form a chilling pattern. Aaron's absence was no accident, and those closest to him were at the center of it. Interviews with neighbors revealed more unsettling details. Some remembered late-night arguments, hushed and heated between Emily and Jason in the days before Aaron's disappearance. Others recalled seeing Aaron appear tense, avoiding eye contact, as if he sensed an unseen threat within his own home. These testimonies, once corroborated with forensic and digital evidence, started to paint a damning picture. Emily and Jason, when questioned further, displayed subtle cracks in their composure. Their rehearsed statements, previously calm, measured, and convincing, now faltered under scrutiny. Inconsistencies emerged, slight differences in timelines, vague explanations for Aaron's absence, and nervous gestures that betrayed their attempts at control. The facade of a perfect, concerned family was slowly dissolving. By the second week of the investigation, the police were certain they were no longer dealing with a simple missing person case. The narrative shifted. Aaron Bennett had been the victim of a deliberate act, orchestrated by those he trusted most. The community, once lulled into a false sense of normalcy, began to grasp the gravity of the situation. Shock and disbelief rippled through Milford County, leaving neighbors questioning not only the Bennett family but the very nature of appearances and trust in small-town life. As the evidence mounted, the horrifying reality crystallized. Emily Bennett and Jason Carter had taken Aaron's life in a misguided attempt to preserve family honor, a rationale rooted in fear, stigma, and obsession. The town struggled to reconcile the ordinary facades they had seen with the extraordinary betrayal that had occurred behind closed doors. Experts brought in to consult on the case highlighted the broader implications. Honor-based violence, while rare in America, was not unheard of, especially when combined with deeply ingrained stigma here surrounding Aaron's HIV status. In Milford County, the tragedy exposed vulnerabilities in societal understanding, legal preparedness, and the dangerous consequences of secrecy. The unraveling continued as investigators meticulously reconstructed the final hours of Aaron's life. Step by step, detail by detail, the methodical planning, execution, and concealment of the crime became horrifyingly clear. Each revelation amplified the shock. The young man who had trusted his own family was betrayed in the most intimate way, his life extinguished by those who should have protected him. By the time formal charges were filed, the scale of the betrayal had become undeniable. Emily and Jason were arrested, their calm public personas shattered under the weight of evidence. The investigation, once tentative, now bore a stark message to the community. Secrecy, stigma, and misplaced notions of honor could have deadly consequences. Milford County would never view its familiar streets, its friendly neighbors, or even its own families in quite the same way again. The tragedy of Aaron Bennett's death did more than shatter a family. It exposed a hidden tension in small-town America, where outdated notions of honor could intersect with modern social stigmas in deadly ways. Though honor-based violence is more commonly associated with other parts of the world, Milford County's shocking case revealed that fear, secrecy, And social judgment could produce similar consequences even in the heart of the United States. Aaron's HIV status became central to understanding the motive. Though medical advances had transformed HIV from a terminal diagnosis to a manageable condition, ignorance and fear persisted, particularly in communities where privacy was scarce and gossip abundant. The stigma surrounding his illness, combined with Emily and Jason's obsession with appearances, created a volatile mix, a perceived threat to family reputation that justified, in their minds, a catastrophic solution. Legal experts reviewing the case emphasized how unusual it was to encounter honor-driven violence in this context. The motivations were entwined with cultural misconceptions and personal obsession, rather than broader societal mandates. Still, the law treated the outcome with the utmost seriousness. Murder, premeditated and deliberate, carried severe penalties. Emily Bennett and Jason Carter faced charges that included first-degree murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Their public images, carefully maintained for years, crumbled as the community watched legal proceedings unfold. The case also sparked wider social discussion. Advocates for HIV awareness highlighted the danger of stigma, emphasizing how secrecy and shame can isolate vulnerable individuals and make them targets for abuse. Community leaders acknowledged that while Milford County appeared idyllic on the surface, it had, like many small towns, underestimated the insidious power of judgment and fear within households. Experts drew parallels to other cases where family reputation and misplaced notions of honor had led to violence. In each instance, investigators noted the same dangerous pattern: the combination of secrecy, social pressure, and personal obsession created an environment where ordinary moral boundaries were overridden, allowing otherwise ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of harm. For Milford County, the lessons were clear, if painful. Education, awareness, and community support could not prevent every tragedy, but ignoring the social undercurrents that had led to Aaron's death would only leave the community vulnerable to similar horrors in the future. Slowly, discussions began to take place in churches, schools, and community centers about stigma, responsibility, and the ethical imperative to protect rather than condemn those who were different. Even as the court proceedings moved forward, the echoes of the tragedy lingered. Neighbors, once accustomed to polite waves and casual greetings, now viewed each interaction with a degree of caution, reminded that appearances alone were insufficient to reveal the truths hidden behind closed doors. Milford County had learned, in the most brutal way, that fear and obsession fueled by social pressure could corrode even the strongest familial bonds. When the courtroom doors closed, Milford County braced itself for the final reckoning. Emily Bennett and Jason Carter, once the picture of small-town respectability, were now publicly exposed as the orchestrators of a young man's death. The trial was painstaking. Every detail laid bare the hours of premeditation, the meticulous concealment, and the chilling calm with which they carried out their plan. Families across the county followed the proceedings closely, the gravity of the crime unsettling even those who had once considered Milford a safe, predictable place. Sentencing was severe but just. Both Emily and Jason received life imprisonment, the weight of their betrayal etched in every word of the verdict. Yet, even as justice was served, it became clear that the real impact of Aaron Bennett's death extended far beyond legal consequences. The town itself had been irrevocably changed. Neighbors who had once seen only familiar faces now recognized the fragility of trust. Community members began questioning assumptions about family, appearances, and secrecy. Support networks for those living with HIV expanded, fueled by a newfound awareness of stigma's potential to isolate and endanger. Local schools and churches held discussions, workshops, and awareness campaigns, hoping that education might prevent such a tragedy from repeating. For those who knew Aaron personally, grief remained raw. Friends recalled his kindness, his quiet resilience, and the careful life he had tried to lead in a world that often judged him harshly. Parents worried about their own children, questioning what lessons had been learned from a death that should never have happened. Milford County, in its attempt to preserve normalcy, had been forced to confront the darker realities of human nature, the ease with which fear and obsession can override love and responsibility. Yet even amid sorrow, there was reflection. Journalists and community leaders alike pondered how such a young man, in a country priding itself on progress and civil liberties, could be victimized by the very people meant to protect him. Aaron Bennett's story became a cautionary tale. The danger of stigma, the corrosive power of secrecy, and the fatal consequences of allowing outdated notions of honor to dictate human behavior. And so, the streets of Milford County returned to their quiet rhythm. But the memory of that summer lingered like a shadow. Every polite wave, every casual greeting, carried a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that even the most familiar faces might harbor secrets, and that vigilance, emotional, social, and ethical, was essential to protect the vulnerable among us. In the end, Aaron Bennett's life was a testament not just to the tragedy of familial betrayal, but to the urgent need for awareness, empathy, and courage. His story, though painful, forced Milford County to confront uncomfortable truths and reminded the world that sometimes the cost of silence and misplaced honor is far too high.